It feels like a year since we last spoke, and it was a year. Uh, with In Search of Darkness, you were closing the chapter, if you like, on one highly inventive, crazy era of horror. And here we are now, a year later, turning the page on a new chapter.
Where we did the trilogy for In Search of Darkness, where we did all three films, long form films that were 4 or 5 hours long. So ultimately 14 plus hours exploring a decade. And we would do it chronologically, 1980 to 1989, covering a bunch of films within each year, and then a larger context chapter between years to really sort of fill out the discussion of the decade. And so moving on to the 90s, first thing that we're going to do that's different is we're going to do a two-part film, two-part documentary where we're going to just tackle 1990 to 1994 with the first long-form film, and then obviously the rest of the decade after that. It's a way to ideally include a little more, and we also want to include not only film but in some television as well. And we ready?
Miss me? Listen up! Be my victim.
I'm my number one fan.
Aren't you gonna say hello?
Hello, sir.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
Come get some. Don't be frightened. I have to cut you.
I've heard the 90s horror and sort of the 90s in general be described as the lost decade. One of the factors of this is this rejection of 80s excess, of big hair and big shoulders, and to something a bit more subdued. So what is it about the 90s horror that makes it a lost decade?
The transition into the 90s was not such a clear-cut thing. When you look back at a decade, especially one that we're sort of calling the lost decade, but is it really? It depends on who you are and how dialed into the content you were. But I think you are absolutely correct. People look at this decade and they just say, well, I don't know, the 80s was just so over the top. And then there was kind of franchise fatigue. And then what happened in the 90s? I can't remember much until Scream came along, in 96. And okay, well, maybe Silence of the Lambs, but I don't know what else was there. But there was a tremendous amount of filmmaking there. But I think because the 80s were so strong, a lot of people kind of needed a cooling off period. But what was happening was it was a very difficult transition time for the genre as a thing, and for the filmmakers who are driving force of the genre. So while people like John Carpenter were continuing with movies like In the Mouth of Madness, the Village of the Damned remake, Joe Dante did Gremlins 2, was entering meta territory, but then he's kind of like, let's see if we can stretch this a little bit. I'll do Small Soldiers, next. Or you even have David Cronenberg, who's just doing what he can to sort of exit horror entirely. Yet you have Wes Craven, who's just like gung ho. I'm gonna go full on horror. Not only am I going to do a movie that's a reflection of the socioeconomic times and make it entertaining yet frightening at the same time, with like the people under the stairs. Before he even got meta with Scream, he was getting meta with New Nightmare and reinvented Freddy, who had already in the beginning of the decade of the 90s, Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare, quote unquote. No one believed that, but that's what they were selling us with 3D glasses. But 3 years later, Freddy's back, but darker, meaner, reflecting the sort of grittier elements of the decade, more meta in the storytelling, because Robert Englund, Heather Langenkamp, Wes Craven himself are all playing themselves in the movie, versions of their true selves. while Freddy is coming into Hollywood to sort of, reach into their real life. And it's quite an experience. And, I'll just say that movies were getting, you said, you referenced this, it's basically they were a little more intellectual. I think for all the sort of check your brain at the door movies, which there were plenty of, and we all love that stuff, filmmakers were trying to, studios were trying to rebrand a lot of horror as thrillers. Yet, listen, there's horror, there's death, there's murder, there's fright, there's absolute terror. That to me is horror, whatever you want to label it as.
Anthony Hickox and Jeff Burr sadly passed away.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to have a quick chat about both of these filmmakers. So
Sure.
Now with Anthony Hickox, I think most people will know him from Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
I think considered one of the better sequels of the Hellraiser franchise.
For those who don't know Anthony Hickox, I think we should mention that he did Waxwork, and then Waxwork 2, the sequel Lost in Time, Warlock, Armageddon, Full Eclipse, which I know you're a big fan of. He even did a Prince Valiant film, which is really outrageous. Maybe outrageous is the best way to describe his work. He was sadly gone at the age of 64, but he was a very competent director who clearly loved the material. There's some journeyman directors who they'll take on a horror film and they will do a very adequate job, and it can still be a great film and you wouldn't know the difference. But I think sometimes you could really tell the passion of a true genre fan when they're at the helm of a film. And I think, when it comes to Hellraiser 3 specifically, after the very broad storytelling range and locations of Hellraiser 1 and 2, going, above ground and below, I guess below ground, or going to hell, wherever that would be specifically, another realm, really. I think Hellraiser 3 was a very creative take and evolution of the franchise while ticking all the great boxes, of what this was capable of. I think Hellraiser 3 also should be lauded and applauded, if not put in a special category for its embracing of early CGI effects, especially there's a, without spoiling too much if you haven't seen this film, there's a nightclub massacre that kind of goes on. And a lot of the moments in that film, in terms of CG, happened there. And, it's always sad when people who are only in their 60s, any age, of course, it's a little too early, and so I don't know if you've thoughts about Anthony Hickox and, his contributions.
I think for me, I think definitely his cockiness, his humor, a real knack to make you laugh and be scared, one immediately after the other. I think Hellraiser 3 is definitely one of those films where 1 minute I was squirming in my seat, especially when Pinhead was brought to life. But I was sort of then just laughing at some of the lines and laughing at some of the scenarios. So it was a real emotional roller coaster for me. I was never sort of feeling one thing or the other. It was something I got from actually the Waxwork films. Now I know you're familiar with the first one. It's quite gruesome. There's some gnarly kills in that film, but it just has an underline of humor. And for those who haven't seen Waxwork 2, as I've mentioned, I think in our communication, it is his Evil Dead 2. So just as Sam Raimi with Evil Dead 2 took the humor and just turned it into a slapstick fest with still plenty of gore and a little bit of scares, Waxwork 2 was the same thing.
I think with Hellraiser 3, I think that's a prime example of any franchise as it continues, as it becomes a franchise with a sequel and then subsequent sequels or prequels. It's the second film is arguably harder than the first, especially when the first is a hit. You know, you don't want it to be a retread, but you want to expand the story. Yet you need to hit a lot of the familiar beats so people connect with it, and it doesn't feel like an entirely just randomly different thing. A Troll 2, you know, might say. But ultimately, I think with Hellraiser 3 in the hands of any director, you know, a third film in a horror franchise especially is either an opportunity to really sort of up the ante or fumble the ball and lose the franchise there and then. And many, and I won't name names, but many a franchise by the third film have fumbled the ball. But I think Anthony Hitchcock's really relished the opportunity to make this a fun and scary ride. And clearly, I think when you look at what's on screen, you could also see that he was probably struggling with a limited budget as well, but did the maximum on-screen delivery that he could to make it as large in scope as possible. And anyway, it's sad to see a great talent go. And you know, for someone like me who's about to dive into the '90s and talk to filmmakers and directors and creatives, you know, he would have been a prime candidate to sit down with and talk about all sorts of great stuff. So a real loss to the horror community.
Absolutely. But he's left a legacy of really great work, innovative work. And with Hellraiser 3, he's made probably one of the most memorable entries in the franchise, as the other subsequent ones seem to.
Right. The law of diminishing returns only makes the third seem, you know, it's kind of like maybe arguably in comparison to, say, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. You know, that's a movie for me where, you know, I don't want to dive too much into that territory, but that's a movie where as the franchise was being released in real time, that was the film, even though I really liked the first and I enjoyed the second, that was the film that made me a true fan of the franchise because I found it to be so energetic and fun. And I think whenever a filmmaker can take it and take the ball and run, you know, and score a touchdown, to sort of throw a bunch of metaphors out there now, you know, I think he did a great job, Anthony Hitchcock. And you know, we were talking before this, and Jeff Burr, he also sadly just, you know, on October 10th at age 60, way too young again.
I must confess I hadn't heard of Jeff Burr, but I have heard of those films. And recently I watched Stepfather and Stepfather 2 after so many years. And I think in comparison to the 2009 remake, they're far, far superior because of Terry O'Quinn, for one thing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that Jeff Burr was one of the driving forces of an assortment of franchise Puppet Master films that Charlie Band led, Stepfather 2, and Pumpkinhead 2. People didn't think there was going to be one, and yet, you know, in '94, out it comes. So he really sort of was one of the driving
plus his
figures.
blood wings, you know, like the bonus blood wings on top of that. Jeff Burr was he was the director of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, Leatherface. He directed Stepfather 2, Puppet Master 4 and 5, Pumpkinhead 2, Blood Wings, Night of the Scarecrow. He had just an amazing resume himself, and he would have equally been a great candidate just to talk about all, you know, talk about someone who it was their forte to take on franchise work and make it his own and evolve the franchise and tick all the boxes along the way for all the fans. He was very much someone who was incredibly capable of doing that, and gone too soon.
Horror films became more certainly intellectual. You had actually in serial killers probably the most erudite and charming of serial killers. That was Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs.
Yes.
You had Fear, The First Power, all the way through to Copycat in the late '90s, but we won't go into that. I mean, what was it about serial killers that frightened us that fascinated us equally?
Yeah, I'll name drop a couple other ones that sort of, Ed Gein, which was the direct inspiration from everyone from Norman Bates to, Texas Chainsaw and That Family and Leatherface and so on and so forth. But you also had Ted Bundy. But I would argue that it was Jeffrey Dahmer. Perception of there are these wolves in sheep's clothing out there who could be your next door neighbor, who could be living in your own neighborhood, especially in a neighborhood where the police overlook disappearing people because they don't want to bother, because they don't care. I think what happened with Jeffrey Dahmer and the really horrific real life behavior that he brought to all of our attention, it really made everyone think twice that sometimes the monsters in the world are not supernatural creatures or misunderstood universal monsters, but they could be your next door neighbor, and they could be your roommate in Single White Female. They could be your nanny in The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Could be your landlord in Pacific Heights. Could be, what is she, an author in Sharon Stone in Basic Instinct? It's heightened, but California with a K. You got David Duchovny and Michelle Forbes go on a road trip to write about and photograph serial killers, and they need someone to share the gas money. And guess what? They pick up Brad Pitt and Juliette Lewis. Not a good idea. I think when they met them, they probably should have thought twice. But didn't have the internet back then. You couldn't quite do the background checks that are so much easier these days. But I think that's ultimately it. I mean, she's not a serial killer, but I want to sort of lump her in this discussion. Annie Wilkes of Misery. In terms of the wolves in sheep's clothing, you've got a Stephen King story directed by Rob Reiner. It's James Caan and Kathy Bates. It's an A-list, amazing film. But what is that really about? Really, it's about someone who gets helped and nurtured by the ultimate toxic fan, who is helpful at first and then turns out to be James Caan's worst nightmare, and he's trapped there. Such a great tale. I think these more down-to-earth characters were something that people really connected with in the early 90s and throughout the 90s, moving on to Seven. I mean, the serial killer subgenre really took off, and it was everywhere, whether you call it a psychological thriller, a thriller, or a horror film. Serial killers were front and center throughout, and it was quite and you can't forget natural born killers as well. Serial killers on steroids, and Oliver Stone is actually doing a satire on the burgeoning reality TV boom, and hard copy and Jerry Springer and anything for ratings. There's a lot in the OJ slow speed chase. All these things were in the collective zeitgeist, where all of a sudden you might have the introduction of a Pennywise or a Candyman, which are, again, these wonderful new, or even Leprechaun, supernatural villains or antagonists. But at the end of the day, we didn't sleep as well at night, knowing that real monsters were lurking about.
Very true. So it was an interesting decade for Stephen King, because whilst in the 70s and 80s, Stephen King adaptations couldn't really do any wrong from the audience's point of view. King himself might not have been 100% happy, maybe even some of the filmmakers weren't, but the audiences couldn't get enough of Stephen King until the 90s. And then you had a real sort of roller coaster ride. So at the one end, you had Misery, and at the bottom, you had The Lawnmower Man. So so far removed from his work that Stephen King had is removed from it.
Right.
So what was this? Did you feel when looking at this decade, so this first part of the decade, that audiences had a real love-hate relationship now with Stephen King's work? And do you think it was the same reason we fell out of love with popular franchises, a bit of a burnout, if you like?
I think Stephen King, much like Clive Barker, they had they were fortunate to be able to sidestep really bad projects as saying, yes, my name's on it, yeah, or yes, you know, or the origins are my work, if maybe by name alone. But you know, Stephen King was able to be like, listen, I sell movies to people for $1 and a deal on a napkin because I want to give people the chance. So, but he's not, you know, I think the public collectively knew that he wasn't behind every single one of these movies. The only movie that he had no excuse, whether you loved it or hated it, you know, was Maximum Overdrive. You know, and he full well said, yeah, I wasn't quite in my right mind when I made this, so sorry. But there, he was so prolific, it didn't matter. And I remember myself as a film goer, I knew I could sniff it out based on budget or based on marketing and promotion of the film, whether something was going to be good or not. You know, Misery was spectacular, but you know, if you have like Graveyard Shift, I had no delusions that that was going to be, you know, the greatest film of the year. But when you're in the mood for a Stephen King story and they may or may not, you know, hit a double with it, and it's a good Friday night at the movies, then it's still worthwhile. And then you could, you know, be patient. The next thing you know, I don't hold any Stephen King movie after I see The Lawnmower Man, which in its own right really does swing for the fences in terms of virtual reality, which was brand new, and trying its best to take a Stephen King by name story and you know, wrongfully yet creatively trying to do something noble and interesting with it. You know, a movie like that would, or even Graveyard Shift, would not deter me from getting really excited and really appreciating a movie like Needful Things. You know, an A-list film with very polished and a great cast and competent directing. You know, it was very hit and miss. But what I'll add is that I think because of what you had described there, this roller coaster, you know, the highs and the definite lows, TV, I think, was becoming, people were realizing, you know, Salem's Lot worked on television. Maybe if there's a little more time to crack these, you know, 1,000-page stories that Stephen King cranks out in a week practically, we could do it. We could do The Stand. You know, we can take on maybe Tommy Knockers. It'll be better served if it's, or sometimes they come back, you know, if it's better served on television as a TV movie or a miniseries.
Yeah, Stephen King's work definitely, like I said, I talk about, you know, different points of the ride, and you've got everything else in between. Television was really good for King at that point because of it and The Stand, which I know sort of the younger generation will probably look at those and feel they haven't aged well, and will hold the recent remakes of both of those. I don't know if you know, there was a remake of The Stand.
Yeah, I watched it, and if I could just interject about that real quick, I just want to say I was excited to see it because The Stand is probably, if not the most, my favorite. It's up there. It's one of my it's probably my favorite Stephen King book. And anyway, real briefly, and I thought this remake was incredibly competent, but it just made me want to go back to Mick Garris's miniseries more for some reason, because it's such a definitive, structured story. No matter how you polish it up, it's still a great tale to watch, whether it's, you know, a 90s era filmmaking style on television, or we've got the cable version on, you know, that was more recent.
In the third trilogy of In Search of Darkness, looking at the 80s, one of the things obviously we talked about and you focused on, you featured, should I say, was the era of the satanic panic, that people were so convinced that films would turn you evil, drive you crazy, would send you out to do all these horrible things. And I think we thought we'd seen the last of that when the video nasty era quietened down. But with Natural Born Killers, it was restricted release or even banned because in light of the Waco, Texas
Yes.
incident. It was banned here in the UK for a number of reasons. One of them, for the same reason Child's Play 3 was banned. It was a little too close to home for the killing of a young boy called Jamie Bolger. But suffice to say, this notion that a film would inspire or would suddenly be in danger of turning everybody into crazed killers or into sociopathic monsters reared its head. Did you?
Almost a how-to guide, right? Almost a how-to guide.
Yeah.
They were worried about. Horror is a bit timeless with that. It's like the accordion effect. You know, it goes away and comes back. It goes away, it comes back. Same thing with video games. You know, the violence that the kids. This is all the quote unquote. The violence that the kids are. You know, they're playing violent video games. They're watching violent, you know, film and violence in cartoons. You know, it all comes down to even suggestive themes in rock and heavy metal, you know, music. Inevitably, society wants to blame anything but the guns and the weapons and in their hands and their upbringing or the law enforcement, you know, or the prison system, you know, and rehabilitation, you know, in the prison system. There's always other things to blame, and that's usually horror in any way, shape, or form, and violence on television and games. It's an easy crutch. It's easy for politicians. I'm not saying it's always wrong, and I'm not saying it's always right, but it always comes into the conversation as an easy, very easy message to get across, especially for political points. And I think if people aren't thinking of it from that point of view, they always should when it becomes part of the national conversation. But unfortunately, inevitably in our society then and now, movies reflecting violence as a way to avoid violence in your own life by experiencing it on the big screen and either reacting positively, negatively, or find it as something that allows you to get your own aggressions out without actually physically doing anything about that. You know, there's a novelty about what films are, these kinds of films offer, but they inevitably, time and time again, dovetail with real life crimes and real life horrors, whether it's on a large scale, you know, whether it's a war or a disaster, you know, whether it's an earthquake or Fukushima or a shooting in a theater or a girl falling down a well, or, you know, some kid who may or may not have been sadly attacked in any way, shape, or form. These are always in films telling stories about us. And I don't think they should ever censor films because they're afraid that people are going to, based on one incident, all of a sudden there's going to be mass hysteria. But I understand the concern, and it's valid, if anything, to bring up conversation about these things. But to use it as an excuse to get political points and to steer people away for a moral agenda is all the wrong reasons.
In looking at horror in this decade, and from what I saw from the trailer, it reminded me of just how, I don't want to use the word prestige, but certainly Hollywood embraced horror as a genre it wanted to explore more, to the point where it attracted a lot of A-listers. We mentioned Natural Born Killers, with a lot of big names in that, with a big name director and based on a story by a rising talent, Quentin Tarantino, who exploded on the scene with Reservoir Dogs. So what changed in looking back? What changed Hollywood's mind to make horror more mainstream?
I would argue that despite the stigma that horror, even though it was much more successful in the 80s, there was tremendous stigma for just whether it was franchise fatigue or you know, one slasher too many and no one wants these. I think other than framing things as thrillers, I think a lot of A-listers said, well, let's go to the classic monsters and bring those back, you know. So you could, you have Jack Nicholson who says, I want to do a Wolfman movie, let's get Mike Nichols on the phone. I want Tom Cruise is like, The Vampire Lestat and Interview with the Vampire. Anne Rice's books are massive bestsellers. We're kind of done with Stephen King, but everyone is talking about Anne Rice. I want to be Lestat, whether people like it or not, and get Brad Pitt and, Antonio Banderas and so on and so forth. But then you've got, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Let's get Francis Ford Coppola to round up, Anthony Hopkins, who's super hot, and have him chew up the scenery opposite Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder, and Gary Oldman as the ultimate actor will disappear into Dracula in 4 or 5 different guises, and it'll be a triumph, and it was. Not to be outdone, Kenneth Branagh is like, well, wait, I want to do Frankenstein. Let's elevate this horror and put a literary name in front of that. It's now Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because you did Bram Stoker's Dracula, and we can go to the classic monsters and redo it again. And of course, who played Frankenstein's monster, the top actor of the day, you've got Robert De Niro. But of course, you bring in Helena Bonham Carter. Even John Cleese is in that movie. It's got a great cast, and it goes off the rails a little bit, but it's very entertaining. But I think all these A-listers were like, let's have an opportunity to do this. And I would alongside that and Natural Born Killers, you can even include, although it wasn't classic monsters and it was quite an original tale, you could put Jacob's Ladder in there as well. Adrian Lyne, getting Tim Robbins in this just nightmare of a film that is borderline horror every step of the way and around every dark corner. Very surreal. I think the less I describe it, the better off you will enjoy it. But that's also sort of, that's a film that's also riding the coattails of the Vietnam War subgenre that was very popular from Platoon on, and Full Metal Jacket, Casualties of War. Now you've got this movie. I remember I saw that film in the theater thinking, do I really need to see another Vietnam film? But it really wasn't a Vietnam film. It just was part of the intricate story. Very intelligent, very memorable. I still have really some nightmares from watching Jacob's Ladder.
And let's not forget William Peter Blatty being brought in to direct The Exorcist 3 with another stellar cast of the late George C. Scott, of Brad Dourif as the Gemini killer, who takes it, and of course bringing back Jason Miller as Father Karras.
Yeah, and of course the Gemini killer is all the whole serial killer element about as well.
But that's a film that still, I'll just say this and then we'll move on, but that's a film that still haunts me to this day, and I still go back and watch for more. Because even though it is terrifying with what it doesn't show you as much as what it does,
right?
You still just want to be terrified to within an inch of your soul watching that. Even with the tacked on exorcism, it's still an absolutely riveting masterpiece.
I still check the ceiling above me every now and then just to make sure there's no old lady crawling around there. But I could not agree with you more. When I look back at the 90s, at least for my personal experience watching these films, I had moved to Los Angeles. I was just starting my film and production career, working on a lot of movies. I just come from film school. I felt it was my absolute duty, not only as a film fan, but as a film scholar, film theory and production, to see as many movies as I could. And so my fond memories of a lot of these films were going in with kind of, tepid, lowered expectations, especially with a film like Exorcist 3, where Exorcist 2, The Heretic, was not The Exorcist 2, Heretic, not everybody's cup of tea, right? So I have very fond memories of going into movies with low expectations, but I wanted to see a movie and I wanted to be entertained on a Friday night, probably expecting to be disappointed. And so you get a movie like Exorcist 3, where not only was it incredibly competent, William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist, now directing it, taking control of this franchise and making such a great film in all the ways that you described. But I will never forget the audience reaction when that one scene which is the ultimate jump scare. I remember the lead up to that, because there's such a long, it feels very long, leading up to this one great jump scare, where I remember people started getting fidgety in the theater and started to giggle and like, what's going on? Like the movie is in this sort of surreal, it's not doing anything place. And it just primes you. It's like the setup for the spike in volleyball. It gets you. And then I remember the entire audience, you could not hear the dialogue for the next 5 minutes because everyone was just roaring, and the release of the tension from the greatest scare that we had gotten in quite some time. So good.
Absolutely. Actually, just talking about it makes me want to go and watch it again, but I might wait for daytime.
Right, yeah, exactly.
You're revisiting this decade to remind people that, hey, guess what? The 90s were, the early 90s especially. When you think of 90s horror, you think Scream, really, don't you? That's the first one that comes to mind, maybe Silence of the Lambs. But this film is shouting, hey, guess what? This early part certainly was an incredible time for horror. But you're also doing something different. Like you said earlier, it's filmed in 2 parts. You've split the decade in half, essentially. Which is, I understand why you've done that. You want to get more, you want to feature more of the films because it was so varied, so many great titles. But you've added another component. You've announced that there's going to be a year-long fan involvement for those who pre-order their copy before Halloween. So tell me more about this fan involvement that people can participate in.
Yeah. So what we do is when we launch the campaign for all these films, which we crowdfund ourselves, it's essentially a pre-order. So if you go to 90shorrordoc.com or 90s 90shorrordoc.com, that's where you can find out all the stuff about pre-ordering this film and all the things that you get, the cool swag that we do, whether it's cool posters, physical copy of the film, digital copy of the film, but also the soundtrack as well. You get, we have a cool In Search of Darkness logo patch this time, which is pretty fun. There's lots going on. But what we like to do, and what we've been doing for this past summer, is we don't make these films in a vacuum. It's not like you oh, this is a cool trailer, I'm going to pre-order it, and then you just patiently wait. This is not Kickstarter. This is crowdfunded, but pre-order by us. But what's different is we really like to ingratiate the fans. All these movies are, we could say, by the fans for the fans. We love to get everyone's opinion. Over the past summer, we had a survey. That was a pretty detailed survey where you could talk about all the things that you are interested in seeing in this film. Whether it's well-known films or more eclectic titles, domestic, international, American or international, or television shows, or certain chapters that focus on certain topics. All this stuff, people filled out a survey. They talk about what they're interested in seeing on social media. And I'm taking copious notes to find out all the cool stuff that everybody wants, because this is not a film that's edited by committee. At the end of the day, I'm making these decisions myself, but I love being informed by everyone who's very passionate about what they want. So over the course of the year, we're going to have all sorts of activities, whether it's watch parties, whether it's Q&As with us who are making the film, talking about where we are with the film, or talking about key topics like we're talking about today, and we could just nerd out about that stuff, or Q&As with 90s icons and legends who are part of this whole decade of filmmaking, whether they're in the film or tangential to the film. We want to keep the conversation interesting and going and hearing from you and letting you guys know what's going on. So it's not quiet time for a while. While we're making this film, we're crafting it with everybody's help and involving everyone so they can feel very involved. And that's really important to us. And we've done that for the last couple In Search of Darknesses and In Search of Tomorrow. And it's something that really works for us because I think it really marshals the community, the horror community together. And I think, again, going back to the beginning when we were talking about a perception of a lost decade, I think a lot of people who don't know the decade very well, who aren't true, I'm not saying maybe true is the wrong word, who aren't devoted fans, who aren't taking a good true look at this era, they kind of dismiss it. There wasn't much creativity. They didn't know what they were doing. It's a bunch of sequels. It's a bunch of, what was it? I don't know. I can't remember. Scream. Yeah, Scream and Silence of the Lambs. That's kind of about it. But upon closer inspection, and gosh, we haven't even talked about Full Moon Entertainment and Trauma and all the straight to video, just absolute shelves and shelves and shelves of films that never even saw theater time that we all know and love based on the box art alone on a Friday night. That's part of the story. It's part of the story. All the TV stuff, everything from Twin Peaks to X-Files to these Stephen King miniseries I'm talking about, Tales from the Crypt. It's all part of the story. And we're only talking about the first half of the 90s right now. But it's something that I think anyone who grew up in this era is something that they love to crow about and share with their friends, what's important to them. Listen, here's the link to my letterbox of all the things that I think are cool, and remember Erie, Indiana, and Are You Afraid of the Dark? All these things. Like I said, I could become a listicle. There's so much more when you do pay attention. And back to your question, go to 90shorrordoc.com. You can see all the cool things you get. And you can stick with us throughout the year and stay engaged. And there's all sorts of stuff for the community to be actively involved. And we love that. And we welcome it.
What the fuck is that?
Avant-garde.
It rubs the lotion on its skin.
Ready for your close-up?